Hello, everyone, and welcome to this next session of AAC in the Cloud. We're glad to have you here. This session will be presented by Vicki Haddix, and the topic is hands-on activities for teaching AAC professionals, why and how. So we'll turn everything over to Vicki.
Okay, hello everybody. Nice to virtually see you all. I am going to screen share. And there we go.
Yep, looks good. Awesome. Thanks, Vicki.
Okay. Hi, everyone. So hands-on activities for teaching AAC, why and how. So two sort of caveats on this. I sprained my ankle a couple weeks ago, and which is fine for presenting from home, yay. But I might need so I wrote more things down on my slides than I usually do because I didn't want to forget to say things. So apologies, my slides are a little busy, especially given that I'm talking about hands-on AAC. I realized the irony there. Sorry. So who am I is the first thing we'll talk about, why I'm doing this. Why I think this is important to think about, and then the how are hopefully we'll spend the most time on, and I'll give you tons of ideas about hands-on activities. So who am I? I am currently a clinical professor for SLPs at the University of Memphis. I have had a few years of experience coordinating AT and AAC in the public school system, Boston, Massachusetts, for those of you who may know me from there, and that's also where my Twitter handle comes from. And I am now one of the primary investigators on a grant to build capacity for AAC in West Tennessee. So consequently, I spend a lot of time teaching various audiences about AAC. And I have found in my experience that really one good hands-on activity, even if that takes up a good half of the time that I have, beats all of the talking that I could have done in that time frame. So I have spent a lot of time thinking about why that is and how to do it better. So first, why? What does the research say? I am a professor, so these are things I think about. I have recently found a book, thanks AT Chat on Twitter, called The Art and Science of Training. And this author goes through some reviews, essentially, adult learning, what we know about adult learning. So all of that, there's been a lot of research on it dating back to the 1970s. And some of the things we know about it was discussed very specifically in this one article around AAC on that adults, while varying in their learning preferences, tend to be very practical and need to have experiences to build on that learning. And then Linda Darling-Hammond and colleagues reviewed 35 studies of teacher professional development. I really thought I fixed that. And included in their 7 characteristics of what they felt were effective professional development were that it was content-focused and incorporated active learning, and that it supported collaboration. So when I design training, I really think about how to make those 3 things happen: hands-on activities, content-focused, and collaboration opportunities. On top of that, one of my favorite books that I talk about a lot, Chip and Dan Heath wrote a book called Made to Stick: Why Some Ideas Survive and Others Die. And really one of the things that I really learned from this book is about making your audience care about what you're talking about. You can't just assume that people will care. I would like to assume that, but I have found that's not a great assumption. So the first time that I taught teachers who were looking to be certified in the moderate disabilities, they didn't really see why they needed to learn about AAC. And I think they've never really seen profession AAC users. I don't think that this is an uncommon thing. But So the first time I taught this class, I didn't think about, I thought they would all just be very interested in learning about this. I find this interesting. Why wouldn't you? But again, I realized that they just didn't have the experiences to think about this. So the next time I taught that class, I started with this wonderful video from Gail Van Tatenhove with their now adult users, and they commented on what they wish their teachers had known. And it was a much more involved audience because they saw kids like that in their classrooms that they could then really think more about how this is relevant to them. And I had, again, much better audience, much more involved, much more engaged, really put much more effort into the projects. So really think about why they need to care about this. And then we know a lot about universal design for learning, so I'm not going to belabor that, but thinking about different ways to engage, different ways to represent content, different ways for learners to show you what they know. And it is getting some traction in higher ed. That link to UDL on campus is a wonderful one that I frequently look at. So, and then finally, somebody in 2017, not sure how to pronounce their names, Nairo, Redman, Gospodinov, and Cobb, finally did a study that I had kind of thought that this was what they were going to find, but they actually did some real research on this and thought about the consequences of disability simulation. And they found that having their participants, which were college-age students, experience simulation of disabilities increased their empathy, but did not improve attitudes around interacting with disabled people. And I'm hoping that if they're in the education field, that they have a certain amount of empathy. What I really need hands-on activities to do is improve attitudes and help people see potential. I'm not hugely concerned about the empathy at this point. Not that it's not important, but I just, again, kind of hope they're coming in with that. So simulations, I think, are very much used with a lot of care, and there's probably better ways of doing this. So examples. So quick notes on these. Whenever possible, I'm going to show a short video before I do any kind of activities. I have not made many of my own videos. YouTube is a great resource for this. And if it's not possible for me to show a video demonstrating things, I will actually just go ahead and do it. Typically, it's not really possible for people to use AAC to come to my classes. So my activities are designed around that constraint. I do teach within the clinic, and so I have to say when the client is, or the student that you're who uses AAC is present, and the person who you're trying to teach how to use AAC is present, obviously that's more likely to be more effective for teaching. What I'm talking about in this presentation is much more when you have those like somebody gives you an hour and says, come teach us about AAC, what do you do? That's very much the thing that I'm thinking about here. So the titles of the slide reflect what I want people to get out of that activity, like the goal that I want to teach. Slide A is the description. Slide B is the notes about audiences and some logistical considerations. And then if there are videos that I use frequently, I've linked to most of them, I think, in the speaker notes of the slides. So first example, vocabulary organization and providing aided language input. And I've really made a conscious effort to try and say providing aided language input instead of saying modeling. I'm using modeling as on the hierarchy of prompts of when I want to model, and I'm saying provided aided language input when I'm referring to I'm modeling without any kind of expectation, that I'm doing this for receptive reasons, for mirroring things. So providing participants with an activity like Mr. Potato Head or Play-Doh or puzzles or cars or really anything depending on how how large of a group you have and how many of those things you have around. I found it's relatively easy to get a whole bunch of Play-Doh. People often like to play with Play-Doh. So you can do that. I've also used crayons because that's relatively inexpensive and easy when you have a particularly large group. I usually provide participants with a core vocabulary board. Project Core is usually what I've been using because they are very available. And then an activity-based board, which sometimes is just a matter of taking a screenshot of some of the apps and AAC devices come with activity-based boards around Play-Doh and drawing and all of that. So that's the easy way to do it. And then if I've got some time, I might also create on my own a badly designed board that has just nouns. So in groups of 2 to 3, I have them play with one person taking on the role of providing aided language input, and then the other person using AAC, and then also often an observer as the third person, because as you observe, you notice things that you don't when you're trying to play one of the other roles. And then I try and have them use each board by itself for a few minutes and then try and combine boards and then discuss what happens. Most people initially like the activity-based board, which, beginning AAC users, it's got the vocabulary you need for a very specific activity. That absolutely makes sense. However, some will also figure out that core plus the board of mostly nouns is very useful, and you can have wonderful discussions about this. And when I've done this, I'm either emphasizing the vocabulary organizations or providing aided language input. I have found that 20 to 30 minutes of this activity, this hands-on opportunities, beats 45 to 60 minutes of verbal explanation and lots of screenshots of displays of core versus fringe vocabulary and how to create activity-based displays. So we often do this again later as we go through what we're doing from, if I'm doing this in a graduate school, in the graduate school course, we revisit this several times, emphasizing different aspects of this. When it's just a one-time thing, so if you all have had the chance to watch Tabby Jones-Wobler's videos on her model of AAC training, is really pretty awesome. She has the idea of how she splits down different aspects of how she thinks of good modeling. And we often will revisit this. We'll go through, like, this is what wait time is all about. This is why this is a good idea. This is about how to model without expectations. This is how to provide lots of comments. And so we'll go over that in class, and then again, take 10 to 20 minutes to then think about how you're going to provide the wait time and how you're going to do this with more comments. So next, providing aided language input using core vocabulary with recipes for success. This is slightly almost the same as the other activity, but with some slight variations in that we're using these wonderful recipes for success that came from the Children's Hospital of Richmond at Virginia Commonwealth University. They're all linked on Practical AAC. So you provide participants with the materials for one recipe. They sadly did not do one for Play-Doh, but they do have ball, crayons, cars, and bubbles. So again, provide them with a core vocabulary board. You do have to kind of discuss up front what to do if the recipe suggests a core word not present on their core board. Turn is the one that often comes up. It's not always on every core board. But then in groups of 2 to 3, have them play with one person taking the role of providing aided language input and the other role of person using AAC, and again, maybe this observer. I have found this particularly useful these recipes because it's really designed for parents who are starting on core vocabulary. So if I have administrators or OTs or other people who haven't really thought through any of the language aspect of this, this is a really great way to get started, because it's breaking down into the language purpose of requesting, directing, commenting, refusing, or being social, and then breaks it down further into, do you want to use 1-word phrases, 2-word phrases, or 3-word phrases? So it's a nice recipe, really. And then I've used this as a kind of lesson planning kind of activity with SLPs and SLP students because it's a great way to think about how you're going to design your therapy. If you need to be modeling at a 1-word or a 2-word level, are you hitting all the different purposes for language? Are you hitting requesting and directing and commenting and refusing? Refusing being the big one that people seem to forget, and being social. And are you thinking about all of that? It's a great way to start your lesson plans as a student. So partner-assisted scanning, POD. So for POD that I'm typically doing the non-location expanded function version, but it has varied. Provide the books and give them a specific destination. The specific destination is kind of important, I have found. But give them the Play-Doh or give them bubbles and say, this is what your kid wants to do. How do you help guide them through that? And this is logistically a little tricky sometimes because you might not have a lot of extra POD copies. These books can get quite thick. And sometimes I've used copies of just a portion of the POD book, which I would use with care because it's fine as a demonstration for partner-assisted scanning. It is less useful for exploring POD because if you don't have all of the vocabulary, it can end up being seen as very limiting. But if you give them the whole book, it can be seen as kind of overwhelming. So again, you have to decide, are you trying to teach partner-assisted scanning, in which case is probably fine to limit, or are you trying to teach POD, in which case I'd make the effort to get the whole books. Partner-assisted scanning for spelling. There are lots of alphabet boards. I like the one that Children's Hospital came up with, but they are. Temple University has some great ones as well. So provide the participants with an alphabet board. One is in the role of scanner and one is in the role of communicator. I found observers less useful for this activity, but if you have odd numbers, then somebody gets to observe. And I also found it very useful to give a prompt about what the topic of communication is going to be, like one thing you did last weekend, or what are you going to do when you get home tonight, that kind of stuff. And I've used this activity with a whole variety of audiences because it's really easy. You just need a copy of an alphabet board. And honestly, people can write down the alphabet if they need to, if you've run out of copies. So it can also lead to great discussions about respecting AAC user autonomy. So annoyance of having someone jump in all the time versus the speed of having someone finish your word or finish your sentence. And sometimes how annoyed people get can be related to how good other people are at guessing. So you can have some good discussions about that. And you can also have some great discussions on the importance of literacy and spelling. And again, direction and context, very useful, especially if you've only allowed a short amount of time for the activity. Every time I've done this, I've had comments about how much more difficult it is than the video makes it look. So yes, the people in the video are doing this all the time. You're just picking it up. Yes, it's not a skill we automatically have. So, next is getting to know AAC apps and devices. So what I have done this activity in a couple of different classes, and I have found that just talking about them on a slide is not very useful. But if you provide people devices and they just sort of kind of blunder around on it, it's also not hugely helpful. I mean, it can be, but it can take you maybe longer than you have allotted at the time. So what I've done is providing the rubrics. I usually use the one that Carol Zangari has on the Practical AAC website, but Scott Marfilius and Kelly Fauner have one, and Jessica Gonsnell does as well. Provide as many apps or on iPads and devices as I can manage that day. I usually have people work in groups of 2 to 3, and then depending on time available, have them actually fill out rubrics on 2 or more apps and devices. And again, if possible, I will try and do things like you're going to do one text-based option and one picture-based option, because some people don't seem to realize that there are text-based AAC options, and that's a really useful thing for a certain set of people. So if they have questions about how to use the app or how to program something, I also encourage them to go online and find answers. This is a great way to judge the available support, and then allow enough time for groups to share at the end. And then all 6 times that I've done this, it's really kind of funny. Groups start out like testing voices of the apps, and I just generally hear kind of nonsense. But by the end of the 60 to 90 minutes that I've allotted for this, they really start using the apps and devices to have conversations with each other. It has gone like that every single time that I've done this. You can end up having a great conversation about the app and device similarities and differences. You can also have the very important discussion about how it's not about your personal preference as an evaluator, because everybody will always come, I really liked this one. And that's great. You should learn to know what you like about different apps and what you don't like about different apps. But really be AAC agnostic as an evaluator. It's about the person who needs it. And I've also found that I really need to do this activity before having any extended discussions about evaluation, because most of the time people will come into trainings on AAC evaluation knowing very little about what all their options are. Or they might have a lot of knowledge about one option, but that just because you have a hammer doesn't mean that everything is a nail. You need to expand knowledge. So I found the hands-on time with this to be very important. So next to think about creating communication boards. So the first time we do this creating communication board is an in-class activity that also functions as a way to learn about BoardMaker, Lesson Pick, Symbol Sticks, or Cough Drop, depending on which platform. Or usually I give them exposure to everything and they decide. And then I provide a scenario that I encountered where the teacher tried to design a board for a Monday morning meeting. And I show a version of what she had done. The links to this assignment are in the comments. Excuse me. So as a class, we have a discussion about what does and does not work about the board that I showed. And the challenge in small groups is to design a better one. And I do have some constraints about the number of symbols that they're allowed to use because the activity can't take all day. So I have done this activities with teachers, with SLPs, and with SLP students. It leads to a lot of good discussion about all of the information that they don't have, because I purposely don't give them lots of information about this. But in order to customize, you do need a bit more information. And so the importance of trying things out and maybe not laminating every board right after you make it, because you might need to make some changes. I also have the example board using a child whose background is Vietnamese. And so this is a good time to have that discussion about the importance of cultural representation within AAC symbols, and maybe even to introduce a discussion on bilingual access to AAC. After the participants have learned, or after people you're teaching have learned about and had some hands-on experiences with core and fringe vocabulary and discussed creating communication boards. So only after they have the tools to do this well, do I give out the assignment of go design a communication board to use during one of your daily routines. Most of them do things like go get coffee, or go out to eat at a restaurant, or do some other grocery shopping kind of thing. But 2 years ago, I did have one person who went to a reptile expo. So that led to a very interesting communication board that I had not thought about before. The rules of this assignment is that it can be low tech or high. You can include an ABC board, but you can't rely solely on that. And I do ask them to write up their experiences on the class website and then discuss it in class as well. So what I have learned is that the wait staff around Memphis is generally pretty good about this. Some people will try and use sign language or speak louder rather than, or speak to people with them rather than the person using a communication board. Some students have chosen low tech, but most of them have used low tech, but a handful have used other things. Some of the class discussion after this activity is about empathy, but honestly, most of it tends to be, I did put this symbol there and I never used it. Such a waste of space, but I really need this other thing instead. So it's really good to have a sense of how thoughtful you need to be about creating these things and making the right vocabulary available. I have really only done this with within the course of a semester-long class, because I think you can't just, I don't think it's fair to give this assignment right at the start. That's more of a simulation than a learning experience. And I want them to be able to learn how to create good communication boards, not to learn that communicating with AAC can be difficult. And the other thing that often comes up after this is some communication partners are a lot easier to interact with than others. So it's a good opportunity to have that discussion about what goes into training communication partners and what do we need to think about and all of that. So now we get into more of the creating adult communication books and boards. And getting into the difference between books for adults with aphasia versus the books that we create for kids who are more developing their language. So we first try out some of the speech supplementation boards that are on Practical AAC. These aren't initially really in any way personalized. And so how well they know their partners in class varies, and it leads to great discussions around communication partners and context. And then their assignment is to create 3 to 5 pages of their own books, either for themselves, or I have allowed them to do a kind of a persona. So if you don't want to talk about yourself, you can create a persona. And then the following week in class, they try out these books. And while there's still some breakdowns, of course, there's some more authentic communication going on. And that, again, leads to some great discussion. So again, this is more of a, you really need to kind of over time acquire some knowledge. And there's lots of discussions that you can have from this. So including how to use AAC for receptive as well as expressive, how important it is to help people maintain their social networks, and also the Buchelman and Miranda AAC textbook that I think almost everybody who has to teach AAC in this first semester class probably uses this book. Their chapter on aphasia has great suggestions around creating these communication books, and we go over some of it in class, and they are required to read that before they come up with the homework assignment. Some people end up using much more of a core vocabulary kind of strategy, and we talk about why that may or may not be most effective. So AAC assessments are like my least favorite thing to teach because I think it's really hard. It's not an easy skill to acquire, and it's not an easy skill to teach. So I have found that going through the AAC Genie app on the iPad, the Lingraphica assessment app as well, can be a valuable use of everybody's time. We also tend to go through the communication matrix because it's freely available and very useful. And I know a lot of people do tend to teach AAC assessment in terms of case studies. So I have tried that out, and I do it in 3 parts. So part 1, and this is based on my experience working in public schools, is part 1, they see the information that I have before I've met the client and are asked to kind of come up with a plan, like what do you need to do? What questions do you need to ask? How do you need to observe? What do you need to think about? And then I give them part 2, which is my write-up of the classroom, evaluate the observations in the classroom, or observations in therapy sessions, if I got to do that, and what I did as well. And then they're asked to formulate some conclusions and recommendations. And then part 3, I give them kind of my write-up. So I've really only done this with SLPs and SLP students because they're usually the ones doing evals. And the field, like I said, seems to do a lot of teaching via case studies. So this is a very familiar way for people to learn. And you can also use some videos, although I found that difficult because you really need to do the training of the seeing kind of across time what happens in a classroom and really observing in a classroom. And I think that's hard to do in, 2-minute snippets of videos. The context is very important. The environment is very important. Getting feedback from other people, talking to other people who know the child, if this is a school-based eval, is very important. Talking to people who will be their communication partners is very important. My preference is not to use hypothetical clients because I found that those tend to be a little bit too neat, and reality is rarely that neat. So I like the messiness of it, and I think that's important to train people to be aware of that. So AAC and literacy. I like to bring in tons of adapted books, and we discuss how to provide the aided language input while we read the books, and all the different goals that can be addressed with books. We definitely make class time to look through Tell Me, the Carol Sangari and Lori Wise book on preschool literacy, Karen Erickson and forgetting Dan Copenhaver, I think is his first name, on the 4 Blocks literacy, and then the Penn State website and the All Literacy app. And I give kind of a brief overview of these, and then people separate into groups to go into one of those in detail, and then they share. We've also role-played with some writing activities. Gretchen Hanser's Alternative Pencils website has tons of suggestions around that, and we've tried out predictable chart writing. AAC access is one of those things I feel really strongly about. You really do need to actually get hands-on with this. I think it's hard to teach access in isolation. So get as many iPads or other devices available as you can. I've also found it useful to do 1 device to 2 people because having someone to discuss things with is helpful. And also seeing that the settings that work for 1 person, particularly on something like eye gaze calibration, if you try and use that person's eye gaze calibration, is it good enough for you, or do you need to do your own calibration? I think that's the kind of thing that really is helpful to experience. I've also found it helpful for the exploration to be a little bit more directed. So, for example, my client tends to tap on things. What kind of settings would be useful to increase the accuracy of a message? And then in terms of switches, again, there's really no substitute for just trying that kind of stuff out. So I have a client who tends to get stuck. They can push a switch down, but then they have trouble getting off a switch. What can I possibly use if that's the case? So thinking about those very concrete ideas, and let's try out this switch. Oh, this toggle switch might be they might be less likely to get stuck on. Let's see if that's an option. AAC and bilingualism, I've only tried this once. It went pretty well, but I had a conversation with Jose Perez at Assistive Word at Isaac, Australia last year, and he was very helpful to one of my students who did her final project on AAC and bilingualism, and so we kind of discussed some of the things that he had shared with her. And one of the things that we discussed first is how the straight translation of core vocabulary words directly from English to another language might be problematic, and we discussed why that might be. And then we talk about how translating communication function might be a little bit different from that. So what I tried just this past April was providing participants with the English core board. And I did it with Dutch because it's the same alphabet, and felt it was maybe not very nice to make them learn a different alphabet while doing this. And also they only had a half an hour of class time. So provide participants with that English kind of core vocabulary board, and then a frequency dictionary, although I realized that Google Translate now will give you the frequency of this word within another language, so you don't necessarily need to go buy a frequency dictionary. And then ask participants to kind of to figure out which of the about 15 core words that they could use within Dutch. And then Assistive Word conveniently has a Dutch core vocabulary board, so we compared, and they got most of the words that were on there, actually. I was pretty impressed. And again, we thought about translating by communication function rather than just the straight translation of core vocabulary words. And also, it was great to see that we still had quite a lot of questions after we came up with the 15-word core vocabulary board. Well, what about this? And it was very much about kind of grammar questions about, does this pronoun change in these cases, and what about this? And so, but it was it was an interesting activity to realize kind of what we could translate and what we couldn't translate. So one last thing, I'd very much encourage anyone teaching a longer class on AAC to allow your participants to choose their own final projects. I use rubrics to evaluate, including things like the sources of information, how they connect their project to existing work, the importance of the project to SLPs or people who use AAC, and how organized the project is once they hand it in. And logistically, this isn't that difficult. About halfway through the semester, I meet with the students for about 15-20 minutes each, and they kind of sketch out their ideas. And some of them start out way too ambitious, and some of them just need some help with structure and some resources about specific things. And I haven't been having them go through the IRB process, but I really do need to get started on that because there have been some amazing projects. And here, this last slide is just, this doesn't include the things from the class that just finished, but we've had people write a book about a child using AAC who goes to a pet store, inspired by the We Need More Diverse Books movement. I've had someone create a book about her client using core vocabulary that is amazing. And then somebody who surveyed, a couple of people have done various surveys with parents about their experiences getting AAC for their children, which is sadly kind of frustrating still. Somebody else talked to AAC users about creativity. Somebody else talked to the AAC users about voice options. And one that has come in very handy to me recently, she interviewed rural school district administrators, teachers, and SLPs about barriers to AAC implementation that might be more unique for rural school districts. And then just this past year, I had a student meet with the child life specialists at St. Jude's Children's Hospital, just down the street from us in Memphis, and develop some core vocabulary boards, as well as some social stories using some picture symbols to help with when they get IVs put in, when they have their vitals checked, just kind of help them out about this is what's going on, this is what to expect. And it's also helping the child life specialists understand kind of what their patients do and do not understand about what's going on. So that's been great. So yeah, lots of wonderful. Oh, and another person, her church has a special needs ministry. And so she designed training for the people that work in this area about AAC and how to include. She came up with a core vocabulary list that they use in church. And so far, it's been going really well. She did some great training with them, and hopefully that spreads. So, and then one other project, somebody surveyed and interviewed law enforcement professionals about how they interact or what they know about interacting with people with AAC, and came up with a 20-minute training video to show first responders and law enforcement. Her fiance is in the military police, and so she was interested in this project. So lots of wonderful things when you let people kind of bring their own interests to final projects. So references, and that's that. And oh my goodness, I talked too fast. I'm done a little bit early, but any questions?
That's great. We'll give a minute for people to be able to maybe add some questions to the Slack chat room if you have any that you'd like to share with Vicki. She has, as you can see, a lot of insight and a lot of ideas, and we really appreciate her being part of this conference. She's been a great support of AAC and someone that we've learned a lot from over time, so we really appreciate the things that she shared. Let's see. I don't see any specific questions. Oh, just kidding. There's one that just came in that says, are there some of these final projects that could be shared with us, such as the first responder video?
Let's see. She put it up on YouTube, so
somewhere. Well, how about this? Vicki, if you want to find it and get a link to me, or you can either post it in the Slack chat, or else you can send that on to me, and I'd be happy to post it so that people can find that as well. One other question that says, I'm curious about bilingual AAC users and bilingual SLPs. Do we have SLPs working with people they share multiple languages with when that's possible? Do you know of bilingual users that are working with that?
Yes, ideally we'd have a lot more, but I think it's the realization that it's that we often are in the position of not speaking. I do not speak Vietnamese, and in Boston we had quite a few people who did speak Vietnamese who needed AAC. We had Cantonese and Mandarin and Toisanese and Haitian Creole, and of course Spanish and Arabic speakers who were also SLPs, but we did not, at the time I was in Boston, have anyone who spoke Vietnamese, and so who was also an SLP. So we really had to figure out another option for that. Ideally, if we had someone, yes, we would pair that, but it's not always possible.
Right. We've had a few people that we've worked with over the course of time that they have an SLP, but and the child may speak a particular language at school or in therapy or in things, but at home, sometimes they use a different language. So that can make things a little bit tricky too, trying to work with two particular languages, and not everyone may speak them, but I guess you work around and, like you said, you get creative and find a way to get something, because something is better than nothing. So anyway, all right. I don't see any other questions coming in, so I think we'll go ahead and close the session. But Vicki, this was fabulous. Thank you so much for sharing your insights. If people do continue to have questions, you can post them in the Slack, and we'll see how things go. But thank you very much. Thanks everybody for attending this session. The next session will be ready to begin in about 10 minutes. So feel free to look over the schedule and see what you'd like to attend next. And thanks again, everyone, for being part of AAC in the Cloud.